Tired of transcription headaches? Trent's automated transcription software can convert video, audio, and speech to text in more than 40 languages with up to 99% accuracy. Tell your stories faster by transcribing, translating, editing, and collaborating in a single workflow. We use Trent for this podcast, and it really does make a difference. Honestly, if you don't want your transcripts to be used for training algorithms, Trent really is the place to be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Operations Room, a podcast for COOs. I am Brandon Mensinger, joined by my lovely and tired co-host, Bethany Ayers. How are things going, Bethany?
I've had better weeks. To be fair, if I'm reflecting on this time last year versus this year, nobody has died.
Bonus. So we are ahead of the death game right now.
We are, but if we're like life stress game, definitely not ahead. I am definitely in that, remind me why I decided it would be fun to go back to work mode.
It eventually catches up to you, doesn't it, at some point?
It really does. I woke up this morning to a flurry of emails that came in the night, and they're not even hard. It's just emails. It just happens. But at that moment of overwhelm, I was like, nope.
There's nothing worse than looking at your inbox explode, and then you go into Slack, and there's just like a shit show of stuff going on there as well. It can be a little overwhelming.
It is. I'm really wishing we had Chris Hatfield as our guest today, and that in 10 minutes, he could just talk me down, give me a couple tools.
Give me a brain dump tool, whatever we did last time.
Yeah, I was seriously considering the brain dump tool, but I just haven't had time to do it yet.
Wow, you are maxed out if you can't even do the brain dump tool.
Yeah, it was like a decision between brushing my teeth and the brain dump tool, and I opted for brushing my teeth.
That's literal hygiene, as Eric Collins talks about in our episode.
Yeah. So I did, just as not a funny story, but just as a moment last night, I was coming down on the train from Manchester, and it wasn't a very full train. It was 6:15 at night, so we passed rush hour. I had the entire table to myself. I was relaxing. It was great. And just before the train left, an asshole of a guy sat across from me. And he's some sales guy, sales leader, super cool, and ate his crisps, ate his tuna sandwich, shouting on his phone about this shit employee and that shit person, and that person's not worth saving that they've resigned, and on with the crisps and the tuna sandwich and the talking with an open mouth and the lip smacking. It's just I can't. It's just such an unpleasant experience. And so I put on my noise canceling headphones, and I'm not actually a big music person, but I had put some music on to drown him out because the noise canceling on its own wasn't sufficient.
You need some visual canceling software as well to exit him from your site.
Exactly, because I was trying to be on my phone, but I was holding my phone up so that I didn't bend my neck to get neck problems, in later life. But then I could see him through my phone. So I just had to close my eyes and wait for it to finish. And then luckily sometime in, Stockport or something, he lost reception and finally gave up. But the first 20 minutes of the train journey was horrific. I obviously should not hate people, and there was no reason to hate this man.
Sometimes you just want to avoid public transport for these reasons, I think, trains and buses, because you get random people doing random shit and it just drives you insane.
And his behavior cleared out all of the surrounding seats from us. And we started with people sitting, everywhere. And by the end of his journey, by the end of Stockport, it was just me and him. The rest of the carriage was full on the back.
You stuck on through, just like an operator COO would, to the very end.
I had the only reserved seat in the carriage. That was my seat. I had planned.
Nice. You were not going to give up your much deserved and reserved seat.
Exactly. So anyhow, that's kind of maybe an allegory for how my life is right now. Maybe I need to let go of things a little bit rather than dig my heels in and hate the rest of the world.
I did a small talk last night. So I was relating this story of back in 2009, I was part of this company called Nuance Communications, and I'd been promoted 5 times in 5 years, if you can imagine at this point. So I was the hotshot up-and-comer, as it were, running this business unit as a senior director, 200 odd people as you do in these large organizations. and I was presenting my third QBR, my quarterly business review. And I got up there to, represent the state of the business unit, and the CEO and the executive team was there to kind of grill me on performance and this, that, and the other. And for these calls, you would have the entire business unit on the call. So there was like literally 200 individuals listening in as I was doing this. And there was some other speakers as well, finance and so on.
That sounds bizarre. Like a live public QBR?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this is the way Nuance ran their company. Very autocratic, very top down. And the CEO was quite intimidating. And on this particular QBR, he decided to make an example of me for whatever reason. To this day, I still don't quite understand. So he basically personally attacked me, kind of openly questioned, like, why, why are you leading this? Why is this happening? All sorts of things. And I left that call pretty humiliated. And I think it's easily in my top 3 humiliations of all time in a business context, especially with that many people listening. It's all your peers and your entire team, right? I went home that night, and as you do, you look at yourself in the mirror and you start asking yourself a bunch of existential questions, right? One of which was, is this how businesses operate? And is this how successful businesses should operate? And I kind of ruminated on these questions for a few months, and then eventually decided to pack it in and quit Nuance. And this is at the height of the recession in 2009, so there was no jobs to be had anytime soon. So I ended up walking the streets of London, going from one coffee shop to the next as this kind of sad, humiliated young man, not really sure what the next step was going to be. Fast forward 2 years, I joined a company called SwiftKey, and I was there for 5 years. And it was just a revelation that you can build, grow, and scale a business in a totally different way that truly takes the concepts of empowerment for individuals and teams, autonomy for individuals and teams, the right context around that, the right guardrails, and you can get spectacular results based on that, whereby the company succeeds, individuals succeed, the team succeed, and it feels good. And it feels like you're on some kind of journey together that actually matters, and you're invested in what's happening, as opposed to what I experienced in Nuance, which was much more this kind of autocratic, kind of mean culture, if you want to call it that.
It was a company that was acquired by Nuance, right? Rather than you starting a Nuance.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd worked for a scale-up in Calgary, Canada, and Nuance bought that company. And actually, this kind of dovetails directly into our episode with Eric, actually, because he was the one. He was the one from the Nuance side to make the acquisition happen, flying into Calgary. And as I describe in our chat with Eric, kind of like laying off the entire company. And there was 3 of us left. And at that point, I got sucked into the vortex of this vicious, mean-spirited company.
It's an Israeli company, isn't it, Nuance?
I don't think it was Israeli, but I don't even know what they were actually, but they were a machine because their business model was to take patents and litigate scale-ups into submission and then buy them. So every voice recognition patent, any kind of input technology patent, Nuance owned at some point. And of course, they powered Siri and so on. So gargantuan company, bought by Microsoft ultimately a couple of years back. So all those Nuance individuals and that culture got subsumed into Microsoft. So I can imagine a real clash of culture, I suspect, between what Nuance had built and the way Microsoft runs their company. So we have a phenomenal topic today, which is the COO the single source of truth? And we have an amazing guest for this. He is Eric Collins. He is the CEO at Impact X Capital, which is a venture capital company, and the author of a book called We Don't Need Permission, and formerly host of the Channel 4 TV series, The Moneymaker. So he's a all-star on all fronts. So before we get to our chat with Eric, just wanted to walk through a couple of his thoughts and see what we think more specifically. So the first thing that he had spoken about was this idea of the CEO driving the agenda for the board meeting and using the chair as a bit of a proxy to make that happen. And I was curious what you make of this, because I've had a couple of experiences around this that I'll share in a second, but what do you think?
I think it sounds good, but the reality of a lot of conversations that we've had both here and with just other COOs generally is COOs don't even necessarily always go to the board meetings or understand their place in the board meetings or feel like they have a place at the table. And therefore going from the reality of where I think a lot of COOs are to, and by the way, you're setting the agenda, it's a big step. I think it's a good aspirational step. And I think it turns you into like the true partner of the CEO. And it might be a nice topic to cover in the next one-to-one you're having with your CEO if you're not already doing this and saying, I've heard that I should be running the agenda. I would like to run the agenda. How do we get there? Rather than the CEO being the one who's setting it.
I guess this gets to the nature of the conversation, which is what is the actual role of the CEO in these companies and what kind of CEO are you? Because the fact of the matter is, I think in the last 2 companies I worked in, I was a de facto piece of that board and I played a key role in those board meetings and I felt that I should as well. And as part of that experience, I think what was very obvious to me was there were certain chairs that directly reflect Eric's experience that he was relaying, which is, these folks would swan into these meetings, swan out of these meetings. You would rarely see them. They didn't really understand what we were trying to accomplish. And they did this kind of peripheral, circling the wagons of the other board members and the CEO and so on. But, ultimately, they were not very invested, I would say, in terms of making that board meeting useful and important and valuable for all of us. If I had my way with one particular chairman in mind, I would have got rid of him. He made no sense, basically, and he was useless, effectively. So, I have a particular opinion, I guess, in terms of, I think the value of the CEO of that board meeting, part of that value is to work directly with the chair, have a great relationship, and for the 2 of those individuals to work together to drive and craft the right kind of board meetings to ensure that they're successful and you get what you want out of them.
I think it depends on where you are in your investment cycle as to how much is the CEO versus the COO crafting that agenda. Because I still see a lot of investor relations sitting with the CEO. The CEO's ultimate job is to make sure you don't run out of money. And therefore, how you are managing your investors and board meetings for VC-backed businesses is a key moment of how you manage your investors. The CEO/COO need to be very well aligned on what that message is. And I think it would probably be, if you're truly an advisor or a second in command, you would be working together to figure out agendas that get the point across that you want, particularly if you're going for like a bridging round, a new round, don't have good news to share. How are you going to be presenting that in a controlled manner that retains trust in the board?
I fully expect the CEO to be having one-to-one conversations with board members over the course of that quarter, doing that activity and making sure those relationships are strong. And for myself, I always view myself as not being my role, not my remit, so to speak, right? It's his relationships, his investors in that sense. My job was to craft a kind of like as a CEO does in leadership meetings, right? My job was to craft and make sure we had good meetings. So when it came to good meetings, the agenda is a core part of what constitutes a good meeting and being able to run those meetings effectively. So I think maybe in that sense, it's no different, is it? It's kind of like the CEO holds the relationships, but when it comes to that board meeting, use my skills that I have to make sure we get good board meetings to happen. So the other thing Eric had spoken about was this question of what are you hiring for, being the CEO. So sometimes CEOs delude themselves in the sense of, I want a CEO, but in fact, what they actually want is a chief of staff. Or I want a CEO, but in fact, I actually want kind of a CFO, or I want a CRO. His hypothesis was that you are clearly hiring your second in command. You are hiring your successor. You're hiring your in-lieu person that can represent the business internally and externally if for some reason you were hit by a bus, essentially. And that's the role of the CEO in this case. What do you make of that?
I liked that, but I also liked the next bit that he talked about of the difference between a CFO and a COO. And the COO is forward-looking and the CFO is backward-looking. And I really like that division because I do also think it's the way that our brains work. So as a COO, we can understand the numbers and the model and what needs to be delivered, but then we take that information to plan forward. And then how do we align everybody to deliver that forward plan? And I think that for me, I just call it operational strategy. It's not like big picture strategy, and it's not day-to-day operations. It's that bridge in between the two. And so how do we connect the massively visionary, forward-thinking CEO to reality? And then how do we translate that reality to something that people could do day to day?
The CFO holds that financial plan, as it were, And what you're holding is the operational plan or the how plan as to how everything's going to happen in the business. And I do think from a forecasting standpoint, I don't think it's exactly correct because at the end of the day, the CFO is forecasting the future, right? It's in the model. But the question of how that forecast comes to be and making sure that it actually represents the reality of the business, not just kind of like from a number perspective, but actually connecting the dots between the different functions and groups and what's happening with the market and the customers and so on. All the assumptions that go into that model from a forecasting point of view. I think the CEO is much better placed to do that than the CFO in this case. And this is why that tandem between the two of them can work quite well, to be honest, in terms of bringing together the lenses of the operational plan combined with the financial plan. And then ultimately, to your point, what needs to happen in the future is the how, which is how are we going to do this? And that sits with the COO. So a related question on the successor front, do you think this also applies to your job and your role in terms of hiring a head of operations or someone that reports into you that you hire and ultimately is your successor?
It's interesting. Today's preamble just ties to like so many other podcasts that we've done. So this ties to our conversation with Cassie on leadership skills and how to not get fired from your exec job. And it's one of the skills that you need to learn early on is you have to always have a successor. Otherwise you can't get promoted. So even as a manager of a team of 6, you better figure out who is your successor so that that person can take your job and you can take your boss's job. And you really want to be your boss's successor. And you always need to be thinking that way. And that's both functionally figuring it out, but also more importantly, emotionally figuring it out. Because there's definitely a moment of if that person can do my job, then they can get rid of me. And you need to switch your mindset from if that person can do my job, they can get rid of me to they can do my job, that means I can do the next job. Because a lot of people get stuck not being able to be promoted because they're indispensable in their current role.
So this is a question to you because at the end of the day, your natural succession is to the CEO role. So if that role is not available and will never be available, does that still apply?
I guess it depends on your own ambitions. And that brings us back to a different conversation. That brings us back to the Cameron Herald discussion on are COOs CEOs in waiting or a unique set of skills that you can progress your career by being a COO at increasingly large companies rather than the next step being CEO. So I think that's another thing is to look at yourself. What are your ambitions and what are your skills? Are you a CEO in waiting or are you a COO for a massive organization as your next step?
No, that's a good response, I think. I do think this. In my last 2 companies that I worked for, I hired a head of operations twice over, and both of those individuals, super, super, super talented, and they were good at things that I was less good at, I would say. And for the most part, they were coming from change transformation backgrounds. That change transformation background in person, I found invaluable to like execute programs that we needed to get done where my mind was off onto more macro issues for the company from a problem solving perspective. I needed her on the ground to kind of like do some of the blocking and tackling for me at that stage. So the other thing that he'd spoken about was being very intentional before you join your next organization. Intentional in the sense of making sure that you get some early wins on the board to give others around you the confidence in you to give you more space to do what you have to do for the business. Number 2, building relationships, not just in the standard sense, but also making sure that you're rounding out yourself in terms of your back channel and people that are more boots on the ground, so to speak. And this third element of just fundamentally, as you're entering the company, what do you want to get out of it outcome-wise, and making sure that's in the back of your head at all times to ensure that you're focused on the right things from a priority perspective. So that intentionality in those 3 elements, what do you make of that?
I think that is one of those moments of it is what's made Eric successful, and therefore he thinks it will make everybody successful, where we can go back to luck and timing. So I have done none of those things ever. Like I am much more on the hunt for fun and joy and what feels right. And then going into an organization, not knowing what needs to get done and not having a sense of this is my plan before I go in, and very much being open to ideas, observing, formulating my hypotheses, and then creating an action plan after that. But one of the first things that I do, and I ask every single new hire when they join the company to do, is to write on the very first piece of paper in their notebook all of the obvious things that should change, that you're just like shocked that the business is doing.
In the first 30 days or something, or?
Probably even in the first week, just all of your initial observations of like, oh my God, there's no expense policy. Oh my God, why do we have 70 people meeting together for 15 minutes every day? Oh my God, why does Salesforce not have a lead object? Like just, those how can that be moments. And write it down on your very first page, because you'll get some of that done, but very quickly you get sucked into the organization and you become blind to the obvious. And if you can keep flipping back to that first page and remind yourself that these are things that need to change and are still obvious, it makes a huge difference. So I do that, and I ask every new hire to do that. And then for like the first 6 months of having chats with that new hire, we flip back to that page and see what still needs to happen. And actually, maybe there is a reason why something that was an oh my God moment is fine.
I think that's fantastic. That makes tremendous sense, because I think you're exactly right, especially people with like any level of experience from other companies that have seen other things. When they join the company, this should be like standard practice, which is there is an expectation at the end of the week that you're going to create an OMG list, something like that. And boom, you're going to list out those observations that didn't make sense to you.
And so that's kind of counter to Eric's, who's like, I have my plan before I start. Like I very much have a plan after I start. And then what I think I'm going to get out of it, this is hard for me because I can definitely have like my fantasy of like, this is going to be the job that does this and it's going to enable that skill and this is amazing. But I try not to hold on to my fantasies because the world unfolds in lots of ways. And I don't want to be massively disappointed if the fantasy doesn't turn into reality. So maybe I like look at it loosely as this makes sense for my career and is a piece of the puzzle, but also okay if it doesn't turn out that way. But then at a certain point, it's like, okay, I need to let go of this fantasy and this job because it's not serving me, or it's not what I imagined, but it's really good, but I've never had it's exactly how I've imagined. That doesn't happen.
That is true. Do you think there's like a mix of both? Like I feel like I'm within myself. I'm like, okay, so part of it for sure is walking in and, to your point, observing and listening very deeply across everyone in terms of why are they doing what they're doing? What does it look like? Why does it look like it does? And so on. So there's that pod of the on the ground information across the entire company. The second pod is with our level of experience, walking into the company with all those OMG moments of like, okay, what is going on here? Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? And then there's a third pot of information, which is the CEO has expectations of you from the get-go in terms of what they want very specifically, typically. And being able to think through those three pots of information and ultimately at some stage being able to share your observations back and your hypothesis back to the leadership team and to the CEO saying, look, based on what I've heard from you and based on what I've heard from the entire organization and based on my background and experience, here's a set of hypotheses that I want to push forward in terms of what I think needs to get done over the next 12, 18 months and the priorities that I think make the most sense. What do you think of that?
I agree. And like my first time joining Peak as CRO, I attended my first board meeting in either week 1 or week 2 and presented my plan for the next year.
Wow. Within 2 weeks. That's amazing.
Possibly 1 week. It was really early on. Yeah. But there were so many OMG moments that like it was very clear what had to get done. And then I did those things and it helped. But this might also just be the fact that we've talked about in the past, that my brain works very quickly. And so, yeah, just my superpower of being able to see it. So maybe that's why I'm also relaxed doing it once I'm in rather than before.
All right. So why don't we park it here and let's get on to our conversation with Mr. Eric Collins. We are revving up the engine of the podcast and looking for a great brand to sponsor the show. We have over 7,000 listeners now across COOs, CEOs, founders, and operational professionals who are decision makers for all kinds of technology, including HR, planning, strategy, legal, and other tools.
It's Beth here. I just wanted to thank you for listening to the podcast, and we'd love to keep it going, but we're going to need to get some sponsors in order to do that. So if you work at a company that could benefit from speaking to listeners like you, or know of a company that might benefit, please send them our way.
To find out more, go to operationsroom.co/sponsorship. That is operationsroom.co/sponsorship. What is the value of a CEO in a scale-up company from your perspective as a VC?
I believe that there is a unique role that the COO plays in a scaling organization, particularly one which is venture-backed, and where a venture capitalist has gone through the process of diligencing and choosing that organization among many to put money into, and then will be on a 10-year journey together. The question of who is going to be on the journey and who is going to be the single source of truth going forward. There's a data room which starts things out, and that is sort of the source of truth. That's sort of a Bible that everyone uses in order to say sort of what's happened in the past and what's your expectation about what's going to happen in the future. Now we're into the future, that future that had been predicted. And I need to know as a venture capitalist what is going on. Often CEOs and founders are individuals who spend a lot of time spinning and in an interesting and very productive narrative. And it's my COOs who tell me exactly what's happening, along with the CFO.
So that was my first question, actually, or as soon as you were talking about your relationship with a COO and the COO being the single source of truth, I was just like, well, what's the CFO's job then? Like, I always think of the CFO as the single source of truth.
And you all have probably seen in terms of your work, both of you as COOs, is that there are a variety of COOs, right? There's some that are heavily skewed toward the finance side. There's some that are skewed toward the sales side. There's some that are skewed toward the legal side, and some that are able to do the full breadth of activities that are associated with the COO, at least a well-functioning COO on whom you can build an organization that's going to scale. So I would say that I do love the CFO in terms of the individual who is going to be able to report the data. And in a fast growth organization, that data is coming in from all sides. It's coming often from different territories. We're often consolidating balance sheets. And so I think of them as certainly having that kind of a view. And that view is one that is backward looking, a little bit of forecast oriented, but backward looking. It sort of said, what just happened? It is the COO who then has responsibility with that data to say to me, here are the ways in which, based on where we are now and the future that we anticipate, that we plan to build on what we have, correct what went wrong, try and innovate our way to something new. And the way that we are sure that that can happen is because of these next things. And this is the plan. So I think of the CFO as taking care of almost the financial plan. And I think of the COO as taking care of the operational plan. And one is hygiene and the other one is growth for me. And so that's the one I want to hear. But I don't want it spun so much that that's a CEO role. And of course, these are all stereotypes and there's a wide range that goes along with this. But what I really love is an operating plan that goes down to the idea of how are we going to actually make all of this magic happen with the ingredients we have. What do we put in the cauldron, mix up the cauldron, and it actually is going to deliver in a reasonable way in a reasonable amount of time. And I actually think that that's a COO much more than what I have seen in terms of my CFOs, who are extremely compliance, regulatory, reporting oriented, and COOs utilize that and leverage it, but they do something a little bit different.
I find that really helpful because I'm always struggling. I'm an accidental COO. I still don't always know what it is. And every single CEO that you meet is a little bit different. And then I think we do have some identity crises. And so often I think, a CFO is a real job. A COO maybe isn't. So what's my value when we get bigger and a CFO exists? And so I really like your answer because I think then I can go around and say, no, what I am is I focus on growth. You look at the rearview mirror and you make sure we have enough money. But then my plan is to figure out how to most effectively land that money and keep the CEO from, I was going to say go into jail, but maybe I shouldn't say that, but keep the CEO on the right side of reality.
One of the things that I would say about the CFO role is I think a podcast like this is very important, not for necessarily just the COO, but also the CEO and the founders and the board of organizations to try and delineate when and what is necessary in their stage of growth and scaling. Because I often believe that probably what you've found, one hypothesis, not I often believe, but one hypothesis is that in fact what we're finding is these job descriptions that are given to you when you first come in, people think, I want a COO because, other organizations have a COO, but what I really want is a chief of staff. I want a COO, but really I want a CFO. I want a COO, but really I want someone who's going to be a CRO. And so the question of what is the expectation, and quite frankly, I often think of my COO as a successor to me. It's either the CFO, the COO, or someone else. And that person being able to be my surrogate if I'm a founder and a CEO, I want that person to have that kind of skill. So they need not enter being able to do all those sorts of things, but they need to actually be able to eventually own most of that. And I think that is when you get real magic, and that you get not just magic, but you also get the science. So the Ministry of Science, Ministry of Magic, it's both of those two ministries, if we borrow from Harry Potter. And then I'd like to see more and more organizations really contend and really wrestle with, we think we should hire someone because our CEO is not necessarily growing in lockstep with what the future needs of the organization are. So we'll bring in a seasoned operator. And what do we really want that seasoned operator to do today? But do we want to grow that seasoned operator into the individual who is going to be able to take us, once we have gotten past the capabilities of some founder group, to the next level? That's the kind of conversation that I love to hear and I like to think through with our founders and CEOs who are saying that we want to expand our mature bench. And that's often when you're talking about a COO.
So I think that there are a lot of skills a COO has that can be transferable into CEO, or keeping a business organized, connected, on message, moving in the right direction. But there's something special about a founder CEO and that vision and that belief and the ability to run through walls. And no matter what anybody tells them, they know they're right. Often you see that they'll leave and you have a successful replacement, but then you also have those examples where the CEO leaves and the business just won't, the founder CEO leaves and the business just fails. Apple is one, Salesforce is another. As an investor, how do you know, or why are you willing to take that risk? And does it pay off, or is it always ends up being the wrong decision?
Just to be clear, we're ImpactX Capital Partners. We invest at the Series A, seed extension, and a little bit of seed. So we don't do pre-seed. By the time we come in, organizations, the youngest organization we have is probably 3 years old, which means that they've gone through a number of business activities and cycles. They've gotten over the inertia and sort of moving the organization along. And we're really looking for about $1 million in revenue, the previous year revenue, not forward-looking revenue, but the previous year revenue. And so because of that, you have people who have really put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Those people who never heard the word no and can't, these are the sort of people who've moved the organization to that particular point. At some point, I actually see a kind of exhaustion, but I also tend to see, because those people have had to focus really on the care and watering of an infant, that those people are extremely good at the birthing process and the nurturing process early on, and to get a community, a village to help raise that child. That's what they're very, very good at. As the child gets to the point that they are deciding on sort of what their own interests are, and which is, let's say, a scaling opportunity, should we actually diversify our product? Should we diversify our geographies? What should we be doing? That's when I think you often see organizations and founders and founding teams struggling to make those sorts of decisions. How do you get money is one kind of a decision, and persuading people to give you money for whatever the vision is you have. But how do you actually get that to grow? And most organizations will pivot. So they find problem. And even as they seek to scale, even as they seek to move forward, it's not going to be a linear progression up and to the right. They're going to have to sort of retrench. They're going to have to rethink. They're going to actually, especially in the market that we see today, this market of fundraising takes much longer than it did. The standards by which you are given credit for milestones and therefore given a valuation commensurate with what your aspirations are, much, much different. If you are exhausted from the first part of those 3 years that you've had, if you don't actually have a vision for how to do the next part, if around the table you are not being nurtured and sort of developed by the venture capitalists and your advisors, then that's a situation where we need to think about succession. Any of those things could be a rationale and a trigger for us to say, we might need to think about succession. And do we have within the organization the right sort of person? Or people. And that's why I think it's so important to have the right COO and the right type of COO who has the right mandate and understands the purpose for which they're there. And if it is to be succession oriented, then it's very important that they understand the full business, but that they also, that's the technical side, that they also become impassioned about a vision. And they take ownership of a vision, which is what you're saying exists and why founders are so seductive, because they are passionate about something. We people who come in second, it's like, well, it's a nice baby. It's not a cute baby. And I think we should change some things about the baby. And so that then is an entirely different sort of an approach to this thing that we're then being put in charge of and over which we have stewardship as COOs progressing into CEO roles.
Sometimes when I look at some of the founders that I've worked with, they've had an inordinate amount of passion. And I guess the question at hand for individuals that are in that CEO role that have that broad scope that you talked about, are they in a position where they can tap into that at a level that is necessary passion-wise to be able to take it to its next phase, I guess is kind of the question.
Both of you have been COOs, but when you're sitting in that COO role, you have got a lot of blocking and tackling that you have to do every day. The opportunity for you to become impassioned about the business and for you to then sort of, because you're a problem solver also, and to see all potential and not a bunch of problems behind, because you're responsible for solving the problems and making sure that those problems don't become poison and that those poisons don't kill the organism. It's hard to, I think, both do that and then to look toward the future. And very frequently, what we are asked to do as COOs in an organization, again, now I'm not a COO and I haven't been now for a number of years, almost a decade now, but what we've been asked to do is we've been asked to supplement what other people don't do well. Quite often, that's the mandate, isn't it? This is your brief. The CEO does this great. The CFO does this great. There's all this stuff in between that doesn't happen well. Do it. And so you do it, solve the problem, solve the communication issues, the relationship issues, because there are always going to be all of those, and the market issues that we have in terms of our customers. Some are upset, things haven't necessarily gone because we had a paid pilot, didn't really work. You want to solve all of that, and at the same time, get ready to take it all over. So that is a hard thing to do. I think probably both of you are highly skilled at doing that. You don't get credit for it, though, in terms of, is this part of what makes you an effective successor? That is your hygiene. You don't get credit for hygiene. It's just like showing up, you don't get credit for. Something extraordinary has to happen from those sorts of things. On top of that, what do you do? And possibly from there, you're actually creating then a passion for this next thing. You've cleaned up, you've invested a lot, your energy has been expended. So now I'm really interested in what can happen next. So that's where the passion can come from. It might not be that original vision. You might not be the evangelist that those people are, those original founders are and CEOs. But what you probably will be is that you will be not only a very good steward, but you will be evangelist for the new reality. And then that's going to be what you're going to be selling. And that's going to be what you're going to be managing. I think that's what happens. Best COOs who then transition into CEO roles.
And also backfilling themselves. Actually, you have to be able to free yourself up to do a new role. And so you need to backfill yourself. And so, again, you need to have your successor.
Have you ever hired a COO yourself, Bethany, or have you, Brandon? Have you ever hired a COO?
I've hired head of operations twice that have, both became VP of Ops as their second steps.
I don't know that I've hired many, but I actually think about Brandon as being a COO for the organization that we ran. So when we were at SwiftKey had consumer portion of the organization, then it also had an enterprise portion of the organization. Within the enterprise organization, I felt that was my organization. I got to run it the way that I wanted to. And although we had shared resources like engineering, there was sales engineering and other things that we actually controlled in marketing, et cetera. And then Brandon was an individual who had been on the product side and eventually took over the entire organization in terms of the operations of it, in terms of forecasting, in terms of pipeline management, in terms of sales strategy. All of that became his. And so, Brandon, I think of myself as actually having hired you for that role of COO. And I found it interesting. And quite frankly, since then, in our overlaps in the world of venture-backed businesses in London, and you have been COO in two companies that I've known very well, that has been a recommendation of you into those organizations in that role. And so, although not necessarily hiring you in those sorts of spaces, I do believe that you show the attributes, and my intention has always been for you to take over those organizations. That's my intention. So it's interesting to try and find someone with the certain basket of skills, basket of proclivities, but is also a person who has an ambition and both the passion as well as technical skills, because I like that combination.
I was just looking at your book, We Don't Need Permission. And it was this kind of quote around small thinking and having more imagination around your career and the impact that you can make. And the question that was occurring to me is quite similar to this conversation, which is, sometimes as a CEO, you're caught up in the blocking and tackling, the hard stuff. And this thought around thinking more about yourself, more about your career, more about what's possible within Brandon in terms of being able to reach into that passion pot or to have a stronger vision of the future or to be able to express that. I'm just wondering from a mindset standpoint, is there anything that you could talk about from a tips point of view, I guess, for other CEOs in terms of how to galvanize that mindset that there is something bigger and better out there for me that I need to really consider, think about, create some imagination around, and really be able to, express both to myself, but also to others?
It is really intended to say that there are ways in which our complete mindset keeps us on a particular kind of a path. And if we don't work on that in a business context in particular, we will end up sort of repeating mistakes of the past. That's really what it is. And how you as an individual or how you as an organization can actually battle this. I would say, if I go all the way back to my law school experience, and it goes to a little bit of what Bethany said and what you've just asked, one of the things that's very clear is you are not going to wander your way and wind your way through to an outcome. Some people are very lucky and can sort of get there, but most people have to do some planning. And that planning is absolutely imperative. When I think about the COO, most COOs are coming from another role. There's a period during which is some sort of garden leave or some time, at least when they're ramping down what they're doing, and then they're going into another organization. And my point is, if you do just one thing, is to think about how you're planning that time. Go on vacation, spend some money that you've made in a transaction. All that's fantastic. But I think you also need to be planning your journey in the next organization. What are you going to be doing? And I think in three categories. One is substantively. What are you going to be doing early on to get some wins on the board, which is going to give you a lot of breathing space to do some other sorts of things. Lots of analysis and that sort of thing I think is good, but to get some wins on the board. And how are you going to get those wins measurable? Think about that in advance. The other thing is going to be sort of your communication, relationship building with the key stakeholders within the organization. How are you going to do that? What is that going to look like? And what are you going to proactively do? And it's not going to be just, I'm going to put in a series of weekly check-ins. It's like, what am I actually going to do to build relationship, back channel communications, and other things which are necessary for the sophisticated and high functioning COO to get where they need to be? And then the third thing is, and what do I really want to get out of this? The narrative at the end of this role, because there will be an end of the role one way or another. You outgrow the role outgrows you, the company gets exited in some sort of a fashion, you die. But it's going to end, right? Let's not hope for the last one. But in terms of that, what is your goal? What is the outcome? And that's what I go all the way back to law school. And a professor of mine named Roger Fisher, that most people go into conversations and activities without thinking about how they would define success in some future state. And success would look like, it doesn't have to be a long and broad list. It doesn't have to be very specific, but it needs to be that success could be measured by these types of things. And if one of those is to actually transition and get into the CEO role, one is to be able to, get a reputation that's associated with this experience that I've just had at this organization that is then going to lead to bigger things. So I'm used to being in Series B companies, and I want to be in Series C companies that are getting ready to IPO. All of that is then a plan. And I would be doing that. And the time I'd be using to do it is before I actually arrive, and not just planning, sort of my commute, which is obviously important, but I would be planning how it is that those three things are going to happen.
A practical question: in a board meeting for the kind of CEO that we're talking about, what do you want to see from that person in that meeting?
So I think we'll go back all the way to the beginning of this conversation. My COO is the single source of truth. So in the board meeting from the COO, who is normally the person, at least when I've been a COO, I have always controlled the agenda. So I get to decide what we're going to talk about. There are certain things that have to happen every meeting, right? We need to talk about sort of how we're doing with respect to our revenue forecast over the last quarter, or in a relatively early organization, the last month. How is all that going? What does your forecast look like? How have things changed? How are things shaping up? Are there key employees coming out or coming in? Those sorts of things. Beyond that, I want to make sure that I am then leveraging the expertise around the table for something more than just reporting. They've read the memo ahead of time. They've read the presentation. They've gotten all of the reporting that they need. And that what I need you to do is focus on the following. And generally, a very good, and I think an excellent COO is not really playing defense that much, sort of trying to make sure they've answered all the questions that might possibly come up and being so prepared for that. It is putting in front of the board the kinds of questions that are imperative for the organization to answer in order to be successful, and then to make demands of that group. And that demand is, I'd like this kind of an introduction. I'd like this sort of a indication or sort of an internal conversation with your team, trying to activate them almost as if they were your own resources and your own employees. That's an excellent COO. And I think most COOs go in really defensively. So they go in with their sense of the Australian Open just ended. I'm a little obsessed with tennis at the moment. But they're great defensive players. They can hit everything back. You need to also be able to attack. Your job, in my opinion, along with the COO, along with CFO, is to make sure that all of your hygiene is taken care of so that that's not in question, and that you are putting the critical questions in front of the group. And you continue to put those critical questions in front of the group in a timely and interesting fashion.
So it's interesting to have the COO setting the agenda rather than the chair. Well, I guess the chair circulates it, but the COO is working closely with the chair to align the agenda. That does sound familiar.
Tell me about the chairs. Well, you don't have to name them specifically because they probably watch this and know who we're talking about. But, these are non-executive chairs, right? Who are coming in, they sort of float in, they float out. And in the UK, all the chairs are so old. I mean, it's like they're from a different generation. They're not digital natives. They're generally not individuals who have spent much time scaling companies and then trying to go for worldwide dominance. And so you're sort of sitting here saying that person is actually setting the agenda for exit, because ultimately this is what we're looking for, right? We're looking for sensational growth and then a fabulous exit. And so I sometimes think with my chairs that I have to direct them for what I'm looking for. That goal that I set in my garden leave period is that I want to exit at some point. I don't want this organization just to operate forever. Now, I might want to go public and then continue to operate in it, but I'd really like to exit. And so in order to do that, we got to meet these milestone and metrics. And I'm the one who's driving them. I got your money already. And you as the chair are being asked to be a governance overlay on top of everything. But it's me who's the operating person. It's me who sees on a day-to-day basis. It's me who is asking questions of what I need. It's not you who gets to sit. This is Eric. Okay. Let me give a big caveat, and Brandon, I'm sure afterward will sort of have to sort of apologize for everything that I say. But my thing is, I don't want to be on the bus that someone is driving who's not invested in the business. And when I say invest in the business, not financially invested in business, but on a day-to-day basis, they've got other things. They've got a portfolio. I got one thing. I got one kid. They got many kids. And so I need to make sure that my kid gets what it needs. And it's a negotiation. I say it as if I can impose, but it is a negotiation. And I do think it is very much up to us, Bethany. And you tell me if you disagree, because you can absolutely disagree with this. But if it is up to us to say that this is what I need from you, it's just like in a relationship, right? I need this from you. We're married, but I need this from you.
Yeah. And I think that works as long as the business is performing and there's trust in the organization. it becomes a very different relationship if you're not performing or you're not showing up. If you lose the trust of the board, then you're going to have a completely different conversation, and the board will be telling you what the agenda items are and over scrutinizing.
Well, I think what happens in those situations is, quite frankly, there are conversations. This happened to me before. I've always been the most successful COO, that the board will have conversations without you. And those conversations will be about what to do because you are now part of the problem. So I'm assuming, though, and based on sort of my experience with Brandon, having watched the progress of his organizations, and with you and knowing your reputation, that you have been successful in doing these sorts of things. And the reason you've been successful is you have watched the hygiene and you've made sure that that's primary, but that you are looking toward the future. And that future focus is where I think you should be having your board spend time. When I've had the most successful boards, that is what they have been. And they have been our best advocates. They become evangelists and they become excited about what we're doing also. And that's part of that relationship building communication.
I am also on a few boards. Like, my experiences are not necessarily as the COO, where I have seen these moments of losing trust in leaders or in the ability of the business to execute, because companies can grow very quickly and the company can outgrow a person within months. It could be quite shocking at times if things are going well.
Isn't that a great problem? And hopefully, and I would love to be the kind of person who could say, you know what? I was here for the part that made sense for me to do, and I'm part of why things went so well, and it's time for me to exit. Generally, I'm not that kind of person. Generally, I'm not looking to see if I'm the right person, and generally, someone else has to help me to see that I'm not the right person anymore.
So, Eric, it's been a lovely, fascinating conversation. We've covered quite a few COO type lessons. So if our listeners can only take away one thing from this episode with you, what should they remember?
For your listeners who are aspiring to be COOs, or current COOs, I would say the one piece of advice that I would give is that you are the single source of truth for the organization. And that you should actually, with venture capitalists or your other funders, be it a bank, be it a debt provider, whomever it is, that you want to be able to manage that relationship. And that one is one that you want to have built on trust and confidence. So think of yourself as a single source of truth. It is not some things from the CFO, some things from the CEO, but we're combined into a single sort of page or songbook, and we're all singing from that same songbook to the external world. I think that's the most important thing, and that your role is as much a role. We didn't really talk about this. Your role is as much a role of the alignment of a variety of stakeholders as it is a problem solver or purveyor of solutions for nitty-gritty stuff.
So on that hymn book note, we will close this conversation. So thank you, Eric Collins, for joining us on the Operations Room. If you like what you hear, please subscribe or leave us a comment, and we will see you next week.